There's been a lot of talk about Linux lately, but can it ever overtake Windows completely? Really, what would that look like? What would it take? That's what we're going to talk about. Now, I'm specifically talking about desktop home use. I'm not talking about businesses. Businesses, they want warranty support, and they're going to go with a Dell or a Lenovo or whatever with the enterprise support every single time. Not to mention that most business software is made specifically for Windows, so let's just focus on the home use. And because Windows is by far the dominant one, then you have to consider why would someone switch from Windows to Linux and not switch to macOS, for example. And really, there might be two types of reasons. There could be push and pull. A reason someone would be driven away from Windows and pulled towards Linux. And you really have to have both, I would think. You definitely have to at least have pull, because even if someone is driven away from Windows, then you'd have to have a reason for them to go with Linux instead of just macOS, the other major player. Now, in terms of the push reasons, someone would actively want to leave Windows because they don't like it. I think the main one would definitely be hardware obsolescence. So the big one recently would be Windows 11 not supporting their hardware. If you can't run it, like you don't have a TPM or the CPU is too old, that's obviously a big motivator. And in this case, it's possible you don't even need to have this as your main computer. You could get a new computer and just have Linux on a secondary computer and just use both. And the other push reason that I've seen lately a lot is that you simply don't like Microsoft. And I kind of want to separate that from the other push reasons you might be thinking of, which is like privacy and bloatware. A lot of people talk about reasons to switch to Linux as those. I actually think the privacy and bloatware argument is a pretty weak one in terms of why a regular person might want to switch to Linux. I'm not saying they're not good reasons, but remember, we're talking about what would it take for Linux to really take over Windows, and you're going to have to get a majority of users on board with that. And what I mean is, the fact of the matter is that yes, bloatware is bad, privacy is good, but when it comes to Windows, even though it has those things, it's easy enough to go online and find instructions on how to debloat Windows and uninstall all the crap in there. You can download some scripts that do it for you. You can manually do it. And for the privacy, you can disable the telemetry. There's apps like O&O Shut 10, which makes it easy to toggle off a lot of that stuff. And you really only have to do it once. So it's not really a reason to switch to Linux, because that would be way more work than just removing just the bloatware and privacy stuff from Windows. That's actually pretty easy. Of course, it could be a contributing factor though. So that's the reason I consider not liking Microsoft a genuine push away from Windows. If you don't like Microsoft, you're not going to want to use it. But if you only care about the privacy and bloatware, you may as well just remove the privacy and bloatware issues. But now let's talk about the pull reasons. Some reasons why you would want to switch to Linux specifically. The first one being that it's free. If you're someone who is switching away from Windows because of the hardware requirements, then you have options of buying a new Windows computer, buying a new Mac, or simply installing Linux on your computer. And only one of those is free. And it could really save you a ton of money. Of course, there's other things to consider, some reasons why you might not want to switch. I'll talk about them later. Next, another reason you might be pulled toward Linux is you like the idea of having utter complete control over your device. I mean, right from the get-go, you have a ton of different distributions, or distros they're called, which are many different flavors of Linux, basically. You can get one that pretty much looks however you want. And then even if you install it, you can customize it to whatever degree you want. You can literally even replace the entire GUI, graphic user interface, completely with something else. Another reason you might want to go towards Linux is more how it works behind the scenes, and that is the App Store model, or in other words, the package manager model of updates. Even as basically a lifelong Windows user, Linux updates have always been something that I've been jealous of. It's really easy to update stuff on Linux. You just run one command and it basically updates every single app on your computer, even Linux itself. Or not even a command, a lot of times there's a GUI, so it's one click instead of one command. And of course, you choose when to install the updates. Nothing's forcing you to do it, or do it automatically if you don't want. Now, of course, it is important for security to keep your system up to date and all the apps, but sometimes you just want to put it off. Now, these days, Windows does have that Winget package manager, though it's not nearly as mature as what Linux has, and not every single app is on it, but it's pretty decent still. Of course, Windows also has the Microsoft Store, although not every app is on there, and not every type of app. It's only like UWP apps. And the other thing is, even though technically Microsoft allowed adding standard Win32 apps you can install with the Microsoft Store, for those, it's kind of dumb and defeats the purpose of it, because you install it with the Microsoft Store, but then the way it updates is not even automatically through the Microsoft Store. It just uses the standard updater built into the app as if you had downloaded it from the website. It's like, what's the point of even having it? It's just a glorified search for apps. So it's very fragmented. Anyway, the thing is with Linux, it's always used package managers. So every app, effectively, you can install through it and update through it. And there are different package manager stores and stuff like that. There's not just one. Now, of course, macOS also has Apple's App Store, although again, not every single Mac app is on there. It's actually quite limited in my experience. A lot of times you still just go to the website of the app to install it. Next up, another reason that might pull you towards Linux is for better security, usually. A lot of times malware targets Windows simply because it's the largest target. So if you're going to make a virus or whatever, it makes sense to just make it for Windows. Although, of course, macOS does get targeted too sometimes, and Linux is not completely immune to it. There have been targets towards Linux, but it's usually pretty rare. So in general, you don't have to worry about viruses as much with Linux, but it's not because it's inherently more immune to it. It's simply less targeted. Okay, now next up though, we got to talk about reasons why you might not want to use Linux. A big one being software and especially gaming support. Now, this has been greatly improved by Valve. They have their Proton app layer thing that basically converts system calls and stuff so you can actually run Windows games on Linux, and a lot of it works. However, there are still a lot of games where it might not work, especially with games that require kernel level anti-cheat, like Valorant, I believe is one, stuff like that. It simply does not support you running it on Linux. So in general, gaming on Linux is a lot better than it used to be, but it still could be a setback. Likewise, for software, even though there is stuff like Wine, which can let you run Windows apps on Linux, there's still a lot of software where it might not work, or you have to work really hard to get it to work, like trying to install Microsoft Office or Adobe apps. Theoretically, there's people who have instructions for how to do it, but it seems pretty complicated. And while, yes, there are free alternatives like LibreOffice and all that, sometimes you just need to use the software that you have to use. And another one is hardware as well. Now, if it's something basic like a mouse, it's going to work out of the box, of course. But if it's something super specific, like some kind of specialized audio device or some other special accessory that's not super standard, then the Linux distribution you have might not have drivers for that. And if you're lucky, though, maybe the manufacturer has a driver for it for Linux on their website. And if that's not the case, maybe some community person has made a driver for it, but it's also possible that it simply won't work. Now, to be honest, I don't know exactly how common it is to find a device that doesn't have support for Linux for drivers. If it's a big giant company, you would think or hope that they would just make a Linux driver for it, but there's no guarantee, especially if it's a smaller company. Now, considering these things, let's ask the question, could Linux ever realistically overtake Windows? Well, to truly overtake it, that would require convincing the average normie computer user, so probably not in the foreseeable future. And it's not because Linux is too hard or it's not good or anything like that. It's simply that the average person does not care enough to switch. For the average person, Windows is definitely good enough if they're only using it for a few things, and if they really want to step up, there's also macOS, which has the hardware advantage, which you're not going to get with either Linux or Windows. They have their whole ecosystem vertically set up, so usually if people think they want to switch away from Windows, that's the first thing they think of. In other words, a majority of people will never use Linux or even consider it because they don't even care about the pull reasons that we talked about. Now, there is one possible exception, which is someone that cares so little about computers and they only want to use it for super basic stuff like checking their emails or going on certain websites. So they don't care what operating system it is as long as it does that super basic stuff. For example, there was someone on Reddit who says that his wife actually prefers Linux because it's easier. However, the catch here is that for this type of person, you would need to set it up for them. And even the Reddit user said that he had to do a whole bunch of research to figure out which apps would replace basically the ones that she was using, or at least had the requirements she was looking for. So again, I'm not saying that the average person wouldn't necessarily prefer Linux if they had it plopped in front of their computer, set up all 100%, but that is the problem getting there. And in this whole thought experiment, we're kind of assuming that people are going to be switching over themselves, either going to buy a different computer that uses Linux, which you can't really do, or installing it themselves, which you do kind of have to be an expert to reinstall a different operating system. Once you get into the operating system, it could be extremely easy. There's ones out there that are very user-friendly, but again, getting it set up could be an issue. So more realistically though, what would a win for Linux look like? I would basically say if it's near universal hardware and software support, that would kind of remove a lot of the reasons people might not want to switch to Linux. Valve is already working on this with their Proton thing for getting games working on Linux that are not made for Linux, and they've had a lot of success with that, especially with Steam Deck. That's kind of the reason they did it, and it works pretty well. Likewise, you'd have to solve the hardware issue if companies would start making drivers universally for all platforms. That would eliminate an issue, and same for software. And I think the hardware and software support issue would pretty much solve itself once there's a critical mass of Linux users, maybe like 10 to 15%, which is kind of on par with what macOS is. Usually people don't debate whether or not macOS is a popular or legitimate OS. So if there was 10 to 15% of customers of some company complaining that it's not working on their computer, that might motivate them to just compile it for Linux or make a driver that just supports it. So it doesn't need to be over 50% of users, just a big enough percentage where there's kind of like an upward spiral of support. Now, one additional thing I want to point out is that Linux actually kind of has a secret weapon, which is Chrome OS. Yes, Chrome OS is actually Linux under the hood. Now, you might not think of it as Linux, and when people say they're switching to Linux, they usually don't mean Chrome OS. But in any case, the reality is that in the education space in schools, that is dominated by Chromebooks. So yes, you have an entire generation growing up with a familiarity with a Linux-based operating system, and while that might not translate to them actually switching to some Linux distro, you still have to consider this. If Chromebooks become extremely popular in education, well, then you're going to have a big proponent in the form of these schools and institutions going to companies saying, hey, why doesn't your software and apps work on our Chromebooks? And that might motivate them to create Linux drivers, Linux versions of an app. So that's going to be more interesting to see whether that plays out. It'll probably depend a lot on whether or not Chrome OS stays popular with schools and then with kids after leaving school, whether they keep using it. But still, I think it's an important step and definitely helps Linux. And I would be curious what you guys think about this. Did you switch to Linux? What was your actual reason? Or maybe you're thinking about it, and what reasons are those? We could talk about all that down in the comments. If you want to keep watching, next up, here's a video where I talked about how I was completely wrong about 32-bit versus 64-bit apps. Which one should you use if you have the option? I'll put that link right there you can click on. It's pretty interesting. I think you'll be surprised. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a big giant thumbs up. It helps out. And thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in that next video.